All right, welcome back, everybody of World History. Again, this is Mr. Chitwood. Today, we're going to begin part two of our series on World War One. That is the move towards global war. And today, we're going to be picking it up again with our essential question: that is, to what extent should war be viewed as a last resort when dealing with other countries? And we're going to pick up kind of where we left off in terms of the war kind of being fought on two fronts and the war just basically being started. So by 1914, Europe was divided into two rival camps. One alliance was the Triple Entente that included Great Britain, France, and Russia, and the other was known as a Triple Alliance that included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Austria-Hungary's declaration of war against Serbia set off a chain reaction with the alliance system, as you guys know from the first video in this lecture series, and the countries of Europe followed through on their pledges to support one another. As a result, nearly all of Europe soon joined what would become the largest and most destructive war that the world had yet seen. So in response to Austria's declaration of war, Russia, Serbia's allies, began moving its army towards the Russian-Austrian border. Expecting Germany to join Austria, Russia also mobilized along the German border. To Germany, Russia's mobilization amounted to a declaration of war, and on August 1st, the German government declared war on Russia. Russia soon looked to its ally France for help. Germany, however, did not want to wait for France to react. 2 days after declaring war on Russia, Germany also declared war on France, and soon afterwards, Great Britain declared war on Germany, and much of Europe was now locked into battle. So what we see here is what I like to call a triple alliance sandwich. You have the Triple Entente basically around the Triple Alliance in the center, and now Germany has basically angered both sides and has thrusted themselves into what Kaiser Wilhelm feared that was a two-front war. So we have two clear alliance systems being set, that is the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. And war breaks out with what was the Schlieffen Plan. Facing a war on two fronts, Germany had developed a battle strategy known as the Schlieffen Plan that was named after its designer, General Alfred von Schlieffen. The plan called for attacking and defeating France in the west and then rushing east to fight Russia because they now had to fight the war on two fronts. The Germans felt that they could carry out such a plan because Russia lagged behind the rest of Europe in terms of its railroad system and thus would take longer to supply its front lines. Nonetheless, speed was vital to the Schlieffen Plan. Germany's leaders knew that they needed to win a quick victory over France. Early on, it appeared that Germany would do just that. By early September, German forces had swept into France and reached the outskirts of Paris, and a major German victory appeared just days away. On September 5th, however, the Allies regrouped and attacked the Germans northeast of Paris in the valley of the Marne River. Every available soldier was hurled into the struggle. When reinforcements were needed, more than 600 taxicabs rushed soldiers from Paris to the front. Although it was only the first major clash on the Western Front, the First Battle of the Marne was perhaps the single most important event of the war. The defeat of the Germans left the Schlieffen Plan in ruins, and a quick victory in the west was no longer seeming possible. In the east, Russian forces had already invaded Germany, and Germany was going to have to fight the long war on two fronts. Realizing this, the German High Command sent thousands of troops from France. Meanwhile, the war on the Western Front settled into. So, World War One is going to embody what we call a total war, and a total war is where both civilians and soldiers are affected by socially, politically, economically, and violently. Basically, it is also a time period where the government controls the economic and social life of necessary supplies and weapons. So what made this new war so violent? Much of it revolves around new technology, that is submarines, U-boats that they call them, warplanes, tanks, chemical weapons, that was mustard gas, high-powered long-range rifles, and machine guns. And Lieutenant Colonel C.G. Douglas said the particular value of poison or mustard gas is to be found in its remarkable casualty or injury-producing power as opposed to its killing power. So not only do we see a lot of deaths in World War I, but we also see a lot of casualties. That is kind of could mean any type of injury that could take a soldier out of battle or wound them fairly seriously. So we see that new technology allows this new war to be on a global scale, to be so much more violent than before. We've talked a lot about finding conditions and living conditions in the trenches, but if you're interested, you could follow these links, which I'll try to insert as a end credit at the end of this video. One's going to take you to understanding of fighting conditions in the trench, and also one is going to take you to living conditions in the trench as well. And if you really want to watch it, there's a clip from the movie, the Hollywood movie called War Horse, that gives a kind of a dramatization, but also a pretty good understanding of what these soldiers faced in terms of both the physical and mental toll of fighting in a trench. You could also see the activities and readings that we've looked at in class. So there's four main battles that I want you guys to keep in mind. That is going to be the battles on the Western Front, three of them specifically. The Battle of the Marne that we had just kind of talked about, that was in September of 1914, which proved to be a costly Allied victory. The Battle of Verdun, which was a long, deadly battle throughout 1916. And the Battle of the Somme, which we looked at heavily in class, where it was over 1 million casualties from July to November of 1916 in just a span. On the flip side, we see the battles on the Eastern Front. The battles of Tannenberg specifically was a major defeat for Russia, where Russia suffered a lot of high casualties and ultimately is going to prove to be one of the final straws for a lot of the Russian people, as there's a lot of economic and political developments that are happening in this country that are causing some internal trouble that ultimately lead to the revolution of 1917 and ultimately forcing Russia to leave. So this stalemate sets in on both the battles in the West and the battles in the East, but stalemate is a period in war where neither side makes significant gains against the other, where no one side is clearly winning. And what ultimately happens is that this period of stalemate sets in, and we see a lot of death, a lot of casualties set in because these are long drawn out wars and lots of soldiers and resources are being used to fight them. At some point, we also need to talk about the emergence of the United States entering the war. So in 1917, the focus of the war shifted to the high seas. That year, the Germans intensified their submarine warfare that had raged in the Atlantic Ocean since shortly after the war began. And in January of 1917, the Germans announced that their submarines would sink without warning any ship in the waters around Britain. And this policy was called unrestricted submarine warfare. And while America is trying to stay isolationist, that means it's trying to stay out of the war, and President Woodrow Wilson is campaigning on keeping America out of the war, he ultimately has his hands kind of tied with the sinking of Lusitania, where Germany declared this unrestricted submarine warfare. And this passenger ship, civilian ship that was sunk by a German U-boat in 1915 ultimately kills 1,000 people, of which 130 of them were Americans. And Wilson basically issues a declaration in which Germany must apologize and stop targeting peaceful ships in America. However, the Germans had basically tried this before with this policy of unrestricted warfare, and it worked and it didn't work, but at the same time, it was kind of creating this isolation around Great Britain in terms of resources. But after the sinking of Lusitania, we see that the United States entering the war basically gave a desperate advantage to the Allies over Germany. And ultimately, in February of 1917, there would be another German action that pushed the United States closer to war. That happened when officials intercepted a telegram, which was kind of like a method of communication written by German's Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann, that stated that Germany would help Mexico reconquer the land it had lost to the United States if Mexico would ally itself with Germany. The Zimmermann Note simply proved to be the last straw, and a large part of the American population already favored the Allies. In particular, America felt a bond with England, and these two nations shared a common ancestry and language, as well as similar democratic institutions and legal systems. More importantly, America's economic ties with the Allies were far stronger than those with the Central Powers, and on April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war so that the United States could enter World War I. Ultimately, what this leads to is the United States entering in on the side of the Allies and proving to be the tipping point for the Allies in World War I. We kind of will flash forward to the end of the war here in terms of our understanding of how the logistics goes. Spoiler alert, Germany loses the war, but this comes with a couple of main key events. One being the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was the treaty between the Russian and German governments that ended the Russians' involvement in World War I in 1917. And then we also see the Treaty of Versailles, which we will be looking at much more depth and detail in class, that ended the war between Germany and the Allied powers. Basically, the Treaty of Versailles placed full blame on the war for Germany, and Germany had to accept responsibility completely for World War I, and they also had to pay a huge amount of money and resources called reparations to various countries. They could not maintain an army and had to give up roughly 10% of its land. And this all came about at the Paris Peace Conference, which was a meeting of leaders to determine peaceful terms for Europe and how to deal with the defeated empires after the armistice or the end of the war. The outcome ultimately is the Treaty of Versailles. We see the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dissolved into Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, and the Ottoman Empire is reduced to present-day Turkey. Great Britain maintains control of Iraq and Pakistan, and France controls Syria and Lebanon. Russia basically lost territory to Poland and Romania, and Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania all receive independence from Russia. More or less, what we start to see is a dramatic shift and dramatic redraw of the boundaries of Europe following World War I, and much of it comes at both Russia and Germany's disposal. The Treaty of Versailles itself basically took place without Germany having any say. The goal was to cripple Germany economically so it could never again rise to power and threaten to invade other European states. Major players, however, did disagree about how to deal with Germany. A lot of it had to do from the United States' position. The outcome for Germany ultimately ended with Article 231 that placed total blame on Germany. They limited their military. This in place of Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. Germany had to pay the equivalent of $33 billion in reparations to Entente members. That many of the people believed that this would not even be something that they could pay for, but they believed that Germany had to pay for something, and they lost all of their colonies. Ultimately, was the Great War really that great? As you can see from both of these charts here at the bottom, you see in terms of casualties by the country, Russia lost nearly 1.7 million soldiers that were killed, and 4.9 million were wounded, all the way down to Japan even having 300 killed and 900 wounded. So truly it was a war on the global scale, and even the financial costs of war did take its toll. The British Empire, in terms of these dollar signs representing $10 billion, basically had $55 billion in terms of money being tied up in the First World War. And if you're also interested, you can take a look at this table that looks at World War I casualty and death. Ultimately, 37,466,904 is the total amount of casualties from World War I, and ultimately would be the generally accepted number that really highlights the full effect that this war had on the population of the world, and really highlights to us, and this is what I'm going to leave you guys with today, is this idea of your essential question. Looking at this number, To what extent should war be viewed as a last resort when trying to solve disputes between countries?